I'm sorry, son, but the fascists don't exist. I know that the little man inside of your computer box who thinks he's good at media analysis is telling you that your favourite sci-fi franchises are filled with all these fascists and Nazis. I know he tells you this is true, but as your father, I think I need to tell you that just because somebody says it's true doesn't actually make it true. Now, in all my years of consuming media slop like a disgusting pig, I've learnt one very important thing, and that is writers don't know anything. And if you are a writer, I urge you to actually study what you're writing about, please. The military strategy in the Star Wars sequels gives me an actual brain hemorrhage. Not so much book writers, sometimes book writers will fall to this, but more often than not film writers. Film writers just do not know anything. Okay, and we're going to prove that throughout the course of this video. This is a video I actually wanted to make quite a long time ago, though I never did, until today. When discussing science fiction universes, I keep hearing people throw around certain buzzwords like fascist, though I've not ever actually seen a sci-fi government that fits the description of a fascist government. Fascist has just become one of those words that people throw around as a little buzzword without any regard for its actual meaning. As much as you, as my loyal fan base, may believe so, I'm not actually omniscient. And so maybe there is some sci-fi story or show or whatever where the government does actually more closely represent what like a fascist science fiction government would realistically look like. But since I have the object permanence of a 2-year-old, if I haven't seen it, it doesn't exist. So to keep this as short and simple as I can, we're going to be analysing the 3 major science fiction governments I see the word fascist get thrown at a lot, and that is, in order of which I'm going to discuss them, the Federation from Starship Troopers, the Imperium of Man from Warhammer 40k, and the Galactic Empire from Star Wars. Now we're going to have to begin with definitions, because when people say the word fascist, they don't really mean what they say. When people say fascist, they often just mean tyrannical. The idea that the government can and will abuse its power. And while fascist governments are tyrannical, the tyranny is only one small component. Fascism actually has creeds and tenets which you can read about in Giovanni Gentili's Doctrines of Fascism. Now, Giovanni Gentili wasn't some post-World War II scholar who was simply studying these fascist governments that arose just before the Second World War. No, he was the brainchild behind fascism. To discuss a few of the doctrines of fascism, the first would be the idea that the state is wide awake. This denotes that the government effectively has the power to do as it pleases. Governments that are built on democratic or often liberal principles will only ever really react to things. This is known as the night watchman state and is based on rather Aristotelian values, where the government only reacts to the needs of its people. The fascist state, on the other hand, operates as it wills. It operates with goals in mind. The next aspect of fascism I feel is really worth mentioning is the absolution of the state. Everybody within a fascist nation is deemed as a member of the state. Everything is inside of the state, nothing is outside. You do not exist as an individual, rather you exist as a component of the nation as a whole. And the last bit about fascism that I wish to discuss is what is a nation. This is what sets fascism aside from other tyrannical ideologies. Effectively, the concept of what is a nation to fascism is that which you have conquered. The land which the state owns and all of the people in it is owned by the state. It is a part of it. This actually means that the true doctrines of fascism are not actually built on racism. The original fascists were not racist at all. In fact, there were many fascist songs from Italy about falling in love with black women after the conquest of Ethiopia. The fascists only really started to become racist because of Hitler. And Nazism is actually different from fascism due to the simple core question of what is a nation. Whereas the fascists would say that a nation is that which you have conquered, the Nazis would say that a nation is that which you were born from. Effectively, Nazism differentiates itself from fascism because the Nazis, unlike the fascists, believe that the nation is an extension of your race, whereas the fascists don't see race as an important factor to the nation that you belong to. And you can very quickly see why why people don't really mean fascism when they say fascism, because when you start applying these tenets to the sci-fi factions we're going to be talking about, they don't actually apply, and I'm going to explain how they don't as I go over them. I think the more apt words to use are the two types of tyrannies that you will find, and that is authoritarianism and totalitarianism. So authoritarianism is simply when the state derives its power from just sheer strength. Often authoritarian regimes will not care about your ideology, like what you think about them, because all that really matters is if you challenge the government. You can do usually whatever you want in an authoritarian regime, as long as you don't start fucking with whatever the government's doing. Two very good examples of authoritarian countries would be Augusto Pinochet's Chile and Saddam Hussein's Iraq. Authoritarian regimes will let the civilians do whatever they want to do as long as they don't come into conflict with the state. And if they do, they will be crushed horrifically. So usually you're fine, presuming you're not a soon-to-be wedded virgin around Udi Hussein. But the next type of tyranny is totalitarianism. Fascism is certainly a totalitarian ideology along with Nazism, because this is where the state derives its power from its ideology. Totalitarian states are far more rough to live in, because every individual citizen is deemed as a component of the state. They exist by enforcing people to adopt their ideology and worldview, and exterminating the elements of the nation that do not conform to it. What holds a totalitarian state together is its overarching ideology. And totalitarian states are really hard to write, I've noticed. And the reason is because the methods by which totalitarian states will undertake in order to disseminate the ideology and onto its population and, force it, can be very nuanced, and you have to have, I think, a good understanding of people and how people are going to react in the worst of situations to really write it well. Good examples of totalitarian regimes throughout history would be Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, the Soviet Union, or North Korea, or the Labour Party.
I'll have you sent to the Tower of London for this!
No!
So totalitarian nations may not share the same ideology, but they all enforce some kind of ideology in order to maintain their own power. And it might be why totalitarian nations are so hard to write, because it's about getting down the nuances of whatever ideology it is they perpetuate and how that affects people's lives. Maybe I should do a video on how to write totalitarian regimes one day, but that's not this video. But I think totalitarian really is what people mean when they say fascist. They really just mean a state with overreaching power that enforces some kind of ideology on its people. And so going forward, I'll be using totalitarianism to judge the different governments that we'll be discussing today, rather than fascism. I know fascism is what the title says, but totalitarian is more accurate to what people mean. The United Citizens Federation, I think the most misunderstood one on this list. The Federation is often decried as being a satirical take on a fascist regime which uses citizenship in order to enforce its ideology upon its populace. Though I think when we start to take a deeper look at what the Federation actually is, I feel this is an extremely misguided take. Now, one thing that I must get straight is that Starship Troopers has some huge discrepancies between the book and the film. For example, in the book, the mobile infantry has power armor, the bugs have technology. The only thing that really stays the same between the books and the movies are the story beats, which is kind of funny because the whole bugs launching an asteroid at Earth relies on the fact that the bugs have FTL systems. Because otherwise in the movie it's just like these mindless monsters just teleported a big rock to the other side of the galaxy. But because the movie is what people are familiar with, I'm going to be primarily using the movie and use the book to fill in any gaps that the movie doesn't explain. We don't get too much of an explanation what the Federation actually is in the movie, but in the book, the Federation is described as being a republic with the same constitutional rights as the United States of America, with the exception of a restriction to the right to vote and the right to hold office. This brings us around the core tenet of citizenship, which is in fact a uniting ideology. The idea is that those who serve the Federation are granted citizenship. This allows them the right to vote and the right to hold office, which the easiest way to gain citizenship is through the military. Now, this gives us a unifying ideology of which the state is perpetuated on. However, the need to earn citizenship denotes that not everything is encompassed within the state. This means that you must willingly choose to be a part of the government. This comes in direct contradiction to fascist ideology, because under fascism you would not get to choose. Another discrepancy from totalitarianism is the fact it has constitutional rights. This prevents the Federation from being tyrannical, as there is something higher than the state itself which binds it. This means that what the Federation is in direct contradiction to totalitarianism. Of course, these being the core tenets of your government doesn't mean it can't express tyrannical overreach. And so let's take a deeper look at events in the movie that may inform us on how tyrannical the Federation is. The first notable thing is Rico's parents arguing against him joining the mobile infantry. Rico's parents are quite wealthy, and in order to become that wealthy in a totalitarian regime, you would need to have quite strong connections with the regime itself. And so it brings into question why they're against Rico joining the mobile infantry. The next, and quite a damning one, was shortly after the Klendathu drop. The assault on the Bug's homeworld goes, well, terribly, and much of the mobile infantry are killed. This blunder shames the Federation's military high command and forces the Sky Marshal to step down and allow somebody else to take his place. This is something that not even an authoritarian regime would do. To do this would delegitimize any type of tyrannical government. They would not show the results of the battle, they would downplay them or just lie and say it was a victory. And the Sky Marshal would definitely not take responsibility, as that tells the populace that the state is not acting in accordance with the best wishes of the people. And tyrannical regimes always need to hold the illusion that they are acting within the best wishes of the people in order to maintain power. The only way this actually makes sense is if you have a government built on accountability. If you have a democratic system based on accountability, then it legitimizes people's faith in the government when somebody who has made a mistake steps down from their position, meaning that the Sky Marshal stepping down only makes sense if you have a government based on accountability, which you would not get with a tyrannical government. And I think the final and probably most damning thing that I want to mention is the TV sequence. There are two sides to this. The first is, yes, the Federation has propaganda. Every nation has propaganda. That is just the nature of being a nation. But FedNet only tells us things that are true. We know the Bug sent the asteroid. The main character's parents died on video call when it happened. They televised the defeat and the accountability of the regime. And most importantly, They televised people disagreeing with the government position. When Federation experts are discussing the possibility of a brain bug that may be controlling the arachnid forces, the TV host just outright disagrees with her and says it's very silly. Meaning FedNet openly televises opposition to the government, and therefore it can't possibly be tyrannical or authoritarian. So what we have is a government that takes accountability, will televise all points of opinion. It allows its populace to become a part of the state if they should so choose, and does not force it upon them, and has constitutional rights restricting what the regime can actually do. And this is all in the movie as well. This sounds like just generally the most well-run and best government you could possibly live under. To be honest, it's probably one of those things where it's too good to be true and wouldn't realistically work for some unforeseen consequences, because it just sounds that good. So how did we get to the point of calling the Federation a pseudo-fascist tyranny? It's why I mentioned about the little people in your phone box earlier who are telling you about the space fascists, because they don't know what they're talking about. I can only presume that somebody who calls the Federation fascist has never actually watched Starship Troopers. So the issue comes from the fact that the director of the movie, Paul Verhoeven, never read the book and asked somebody else to read the book for him. Apparently it's because the book is really boring. I don't know, I can't read. And so Verhoeven mistakenly got the idea, because he never actually read the book and basically got somebody to glance at it. He got the idea that the Federation was supposed to be a take on fascism because he didn't understand the point of it, and as a result tried to give the Federation a fascist look. But then the only thing he did to do that really was just give them Nazi-looking uniforms. So I still don't understand how people get the idea that the Federation is fascist. People I also hear constantly accuse the Federation as being a regime that needs war to perpetuate itself, but I don't see that. Like, what aspect of it needs war? I mean, it seems perfectly functional in peace times, and like it's just that the film is set during a war, and that's it. I mean, it'd be like saying, like, setting like a film during the Iraq War and then saying the United States needs war to perpetuate itself. That might actually be a bad comparison. The next up, and I think probably the most interesting, is the Imperium of Man from Warhammer 40,000. I would first like to preface this with, I hate Warhammer. I wanted to make a video years ago about the specific reasons as to why I hate Warhammer, but I never finished it. That I think my biggest issue with Warhammer, which I'm going to mention here because it is going to affect what I'm about to say, is the fact that there is a lack of coherency. So much of Warhammer is literally just thrown in just because the writers thought it sounds cool without realising the actual implications for what they're doing. For example, saying that the Imperium of Man is around about 1 million worlds sounds cool until you realise that a galaxy encompasses 100 billion worlds. The Galactic Empire from Star Wars is vastly bigger than the Imperium of Man, and these numbers would lead me to believe that realistically the Imperium of Man would be a rump state that would be very quickly torn apart. And other issues are with its inconsistency. It is completely inconsistent about the power levels involved here. For example, Space Marines may die to like a couple shots, or they may be able to tank an entire jeep. Like, who knows, it's just whatever the writer decides they can do at that time. This inconsistency in Warhammer causes a huge issue when analysing anything about it generally. And it's part of the reason I think that Warhammer is just not very well written. Call me a heretic if you will, but when I played Warhammer, I collected word bearers. Because I will stand by this, Lorgar was right and the Emperor lied. But that aside, let's actually analyse it politically. The Imperium of Man is most certainly a tyranny, as entire populations' lives are tightly controlled by the regime. And it does follow that core tenet of fascism that from your life until your death, you are a part of the state. However, it falls short of being totalitarian, and therefore fascist. And while the Imperium of Man is an extremely controlling and dictatorial system, there are two primary reasons as to why it wouldn't come under being totalitarian, and the first I'm going to discuss is its over-encompassing ideology. So, the vast majority of the Imperium of Man comes under the Imperial Creed, which we could consider an overarching ideology that binds it together. The first most notable thing is the Imperial Creed is more of a religion than an ideology. While ideologies and religions can go hand in hand, the primary difference is that religions deal with the ordering of the spiritual, while ideologies deal with the ordering of the material. A religion will tell you how you should live your life, but it will not tell you how you should structure a government. And this is effectively what the first issue of the Imperial Creed is, that it's not really an ideology, it's more of just a religion. Though religions can still be the ideology of a totalitarian regime. We would call these theocracies. Though theocracies are rarely totalitarian, and the reason for this is that the religion doesn't act in the same way an ideology would, where it is a vehicle that forwards the workings of the regime, it forwards the goals of the state. But rather with the Imperial Creed, it appears to act more like a constitution that binds the state. The state will do things that actively hinder it in favour of the religion. The many practices of the Adeptus Mechanicus are a very good example of this. For example, the Imperium refuses to innovate, they will not make new things. Or I should say, that used to be the law, is that the Imperium wouldn't innovate, but then 7th edition came along and they introduced Primaris Marines and all their new stuff and kind of, trashed the old law. But it used to be in 40k law, back when 40k law was sensible, that the religion binded how the state would act, which is something you wouldn't get in a totalitarian regime. The ideology would be used entirely to forward the goals of the state. But the next reason the Imperium of Man can't really be considered totalitarian is because it's not one state. For a totalitarian regime to work, or even a fascist one, everything needs to be encompassed within the same regime. But the Imperium of Man is not one state, it is many different states working in conjunction with one another. Most of the institutions within the Imperium of Man, such as the Adeptus Astartes, the Adeptus Mechanicus, the Ecclesiarchy, the Inquisition, the High Lords of Terror or regional governors, are all separate institutions that all govern themselves. This means that there is no one state that everything is encompassed within. And they operate so independently that many points in many Warhammer stories they end up fighting each other. So with no overarching centralised power, there is no real way that the Imperium of Man can be really considered a totalitarian regime. I think you can make the argument that individual states within it might be totalitarian, bit like each one individually. However, it would be a stretch to say that the entire Imperium of Man is totalitarian. I mean, this also would lead me to believe that if the Imperium of Man were to really exist, then it would just rip itself apart. The existence of separate states working together is probably quite realistic for how big a sort of like galactic-wide empire would have to be, but you would also need some overarching centralised power to keep it together, meaning that the Imperium of Man in general is just wholly unrealistic. And you fat, disgusting neckbeards can just cry about it in my comment section. So the Galactic Empire is going to be the most interesting one to talk about, and I've already made a video a long time ago about how I would improve the way the Galactic Empire is done, because I really don't like the way it's written. And the primary reason for that is the Galactic Empire wears the skin suit of a totalitarian regime, but then doesn't actually do anything a totalitarian regime would do. The first thing I think that is most notable about this is the state exists separate from its people. So they're very clearly trying to invoke like Nazi racial ideology by making it like sort of pro-human, anti-alien, but they don't define what this ideology ever actually is. It's like, well, we're pro-human. It's like, okay, but why? And the reason for this is the concept that I mentioned before of what is a nation, because the Galactic Empire seems to be very bipolar about this. The idea that it believes that humans are the superior race means that the Galactic Empire would see humans as its nation, meaning it would be following Nazi ideology in the same way that, the Nazi Germany saw Germans as their constituency, as their nation. But then the empire seems to more so be predicated on territory. It conquers other lands at whim, and I don't see any notable effort to really displace any aliens. And there's no real establishing reason as to why the Galactic Empire would view humans as superior anyway. They don't define it. Like, aliens and humans seem to be on the same level mentally. They have all lived in peace for thousands of years until now. Like, why would the Empire suddenly change that? And because of this, it just ends up looking like the Imperial government exists atomized from the rest of its population. Like, if it was a totalitarian state, it would encompass everything, right? Everything within its borders. So, why didn't the Galactic Empire just go and shut down the shipyards in the Mon Calamari system? Like, how did they just let all of these warships end up in the hands of the rebels? Surely if it was totalitarian, it would have such strict control over the businesses and what they can and can't sell and who they can and can't sell to. And the other thing is working with criminal elements. Like, why would the Galactic Empire work with, let's say, Jabba the Hutt, right? As, like, they have been depicted to do so in some stories. Like, why would they work with bounty hunters? What, do they not have their own assassins? Do they just have that little control over their population? I mean, I guess they must do, because that's the only feasible way that the Galactic Empire could actually exist. And if the Empire has such little constituents and support amongst its people, how did it even become like a thing in the first place? Like, for the Empire to even form, it would have needed popular support. Like, I mean, Hitler came to power because people voted for him. Like, are you telling me they got to power and then just instantly pissed off their population? Like, surely Palpatine, like, who's deemed as this, like, really intelligent genius, would have been able to foresee something like this, right? And I know shows like The Bad Batch or Andor have shown the Empire trying to slowly gain, like, its power, like, it comes into place and it begins subsuming everything, which is really good writing. That is what I would expect. But then the problem with that is, it just doesn't do anything it would actually do when it has that power. And like, it just does things it wouldn't do. The Galactic Empire is set up really well to be an actually authoritarian regime, but it's like, take Operation Cinder, for example, right? Like, why would it do that? Why is it that after the death of the Emperor, it's triggered so that, like, tons of the Empire's own worlds are to be destroyed? Like, all that's gonna do is make people hate you more and just feed the rebellion. It's like, basically, the Empire did everything I would expect it to do if it wanted to lose. And then, like, what even is its overarching ideology? It doesn't seem to have any. Like, both the Imperium of Man and the Federation from Starship Troopers have some kind of ideology. The Galactic Empire just doesn't. They say like order, you'll always hear them talk about enforcing order, but order in of itself is not an ideology, because the question is, how are you ordering it though? Order is a state of being. The method by which you order it is the ideology. But none of that is really explained. There doesn't appear to be an overarching encompassing ideology of the Empire, and if there was, you would have to base it on the events of the Clone Wars. Like, the ideology of the Empire would have to be something along the lines of, ironically, being anti-war. You could make it like 1984 doublespeak, where it's like, well, we must conquer everybody else in order to gain peace. But the ideology would have to be something along the lines of, we need to control your lives in order to ensure like stability and peace. And what form that takes would have to be up to whoever's writing it. But then, you know, it's set up for an ideology, but then just doesn't have one. There just doesn't seem to be anything ideological about the Empire. Nobody in the Empire talks about any kind of like ideology. It doesn't like, oh god, the Empire just doesn't do what it's supposed to do, what it should do, if it's going to be that kind of regime. I think it should be mandatory for anybody who's going to try write a totalitarian regime to just read Solzhenitsyn's Gulag Archipelago. But the Galactic Empire does seem to, you know, at least try come down like a ton of bricks on people who try fuck with whatever the government's doing. But it then also appears to just not care about what its population is doing. Like, it literally just allows criminal gangs underneath its underneath its rule, which a totalitarian regime would never do. So because of that aspect of it just doesn't care unless you fuck with the regime itself, would lead me to have to say that the Galactic Empire is actually an authoritarian regime. It's not fascist, it's not totalitarian, it's just an extremely incompetent authoritarian regime. But if you want to hear me discuss my thoughts more on the Galactic Empire and how I'd want to fix it, you should definitely watch my video on it. So, to give a brief summary, the United Citizens Federation is a constitutional republic. The Imperium of Man is a theocratic coalition, while the Galactic Empire is an idiocracy. None of them come under being totalitarian, and they're definitely not fascist. Though both the Imperium and the Galactic Empire are certainly tyrannical. Actually, you know another thing, is the Galactic Empire tyrannical? Given how, as we've established, it seems to let its population do whatever it wants. I'll have to get back to you on that one, but the Imperium of Man is definitely tyrannical. Now, with all that said, if you can think of any more regimes that people call fascist and isn't, or that you think is a genuinely good depiction of totalitarianism, then please, write it in the comments. I did intentionally stick with human empires because we are human and so it's easier to understand it. So if you enjoyed this video and you want me to analyse more pieces of media in this style, then don't be afraid to make yourself known. If by chance you thought this analysis was shit and I should never be allowed to speak again, then feel free to tell me to kill myself in the comments below. And be sure to tune in when I decide to upload again in about 2,000 years.